I'm so excited to have Maria Potvin on the podcast. She wrote an article called 10 Powerful and Effective Strategies to Promote and Support Reading at Home for Bilingual Children. You had me at the title, Maria. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Maria, can you start us off with telling a story about your own multilingual reading journey?
Yes, of course. This is actually how I got interested in languages and I got interested in reading as well. I grew up with my grandparents, and my grandfather was bilingual, Bulgarian and Russian. And he was the one who taught me how to read. And we spent many, many days together when I was reading in Russian, and he would translate it for me. And because I was born and raised in Bulgaria, it's the same Cyrillic alphabet. It wasn't that difficult just to decode, and a lot of words are similar, but it's the emotion that I created with reading and the fascination that started with being exposed to multiple languages. And for me, it was self-explanatory that I want to have a lot of languages in my life, and I want to be able to access books in the original language, because there is always something to learn. There is about how people do life, about how people experience different things, because language is shaped, based on the mentality of people, and everybody sees things through a different lens. So I was lucky enough to experience this quite early, and that's why I also left Bulgaria when I was 18. And moved to Germany to study.
So how many languages do you speak?
Well, I'm fluent in Bulgarian, German, and English. And then I understand a lot of Russian. I understand a lot of Dutch. And of course, a lot of the Eastern European languages, I understand more or less depending on the language.
So you're a polyglot. So what do you notice about a person who learns multiple languages?
I think we're very flexible. And I believe that people who speak multiple languages are also a lot more empathetic, because they know what it's like not to be understood sometimes, and to be what it is to try and find ways to express oneself. So we are a lot more tolerant to mistakes as well. And we're very grateful if a person has decided to learn and try to speak one of the languages that we speak, if none of the languages match, right? Yeah.
Well, privet, Maria.
Privet.
I know a few phrases in Russian, so I'll save the other few later.
Yes.
Would you tell us about where you come from right now? Like, what's your work context, so people know your expertise?
Yes. I have a degree in linguistics and applied linguistics. And I have a qualification in teaching multilingual learners. And currently I work for raising bilingual children together with two colleagues, Daphne Vlahoyanis and Eowyn Crisfield. And we work with families. We help them on their multilingual journey, basically everything that it entails: planning for their goals, planning for input, planning for literacy, we help them to reach their goals.
That's because in bilingual families, it doesn't happen by accident. It's an intentional act. And so, but a lot of parents, like for my example, my family, we wanted my family to be bilingual, but they didn't realize, like, oh my goodness, what does that really mean? And what does that entail?
Yes, you have to be really intentional. A lot of people sort of wing it or decide to wing it, and eventually are not particularly happy with the results. I think, first of all, you need to start with learning about bilingualism, multilingualism in development, what it entails and what it means. And then you have to be really honest with yourself about your family and about your children. What languages, because you might have 5, 6, 7 languages to choose from, but you need to be really honest about which languages you want to choose and pass to your children. And only after having decided this, can you make the decision what strategies to apply and how to do it. But having learned about multilingualism, you are then able to troubleshoot on the way, let's say, and you understand what's normal and what's not normal. But you're absolutely right. You need to be intentional if you want to achieve concrete results.
Well, let's talk about some concrete results. Let's talk about first, why should we support literacy at home and in our home languages?
There are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, it's important, they're in no particular order, but it's important to sustain the culture. It's important to preserve the culture and to pass on the culture, to share experiences. So home language literacy is a bridge to the home culture, so to say. And knowing where they come from, knowing a part of the different parts of them, of them that they can identify with, it's children can be more grounded and they can appear in the world being more self-confident. And of course, a huge reason why is because reading is super important for home language sustenance and for language learning. It helps children to develop a strong foundation in their home language, and it promotes a love for reading, which is super important. In order to sustain the language over time, you have to teach your children to learn to read for pleasure. So you sort of raise lifelong readers.
Yeah, I often see in international schools, parents will say, oh yeah, I only speak English at home with my kid. I'm like, but English is not your most fluent language. I know what they're trying to do. They're trying to get their student ready, but at the, like, what do you say with that? Like, let's say that there's a Thai family who speaks Thai more fluently than English, but chooses to use English at home with their child in preparation of them going to international schools.
Well, I would, of course, ask a few more questions about the exact language allocation and dynamic at home. But as a rule of thumb, it's super important to preserve the home language because it helps develop cognitive skills. And when the cognitive skills are developed, suitable for the certain age, then it's much easier for them to learn the school language. And consequently, then they're able to achieve better academic results. And it helps. Languages are all connected. So when we are good in our home language, when we are able to develop a mature level, it's going to be much easier to learn the school language. And then the same goes for literacy. It's transferable. So, and also building on the home language is not going to interfere with learning the school language in any way.
Yeah, often parents say, I'm afraid that if I don't speak English, it's going to, their Thai, their Khmer, their Lao is going to interfere with their English. I'm like, that could not be further from the truth.
Yes. And unfortunately, a lot of mainstream schools still give this advice to parents. And sometimes also it has to do with the language status, the home language of the family. Very, very unfortunate, but sadly a fact.
Can you talk more about that? What is home language? What is language status?
Well, every language has a particular status based on the setting, right? So some languages, well, let's say not all languages are created equal in a certain country, sadly. And some languages are treated as being much lower level than other languages. Let's say in Europe, French, Spanish, English are very high status languages. And if you are an English speaking kid who comes to, let's say, Dutch school or French school, it's much less likely to be advised to abandon your home language because it's a very high status language and it's a very useful language. But there are other languages. I'll give you my home language, Bulgarian, as an example. Eastern European languages are not very popular languages, not very high status languages. And there is a very high chance that if my son, for example, is doing really bad or not that well in school, that they might say, oh, this is because there are too many languages at home, and just drop the languages and focus on Dutch, even though we're not Dutch speakers. We speak a bit, but by far not enough to pass on this language on an academic level.
Let's talk about how does reading at home support language development for multilingual children?
Reading promotes language learning. This is a fact. And a child's so we basically learn language when we learn vocabulary through input and figuring out how language works. So the more a child is being read to, the more their vocabulary size expands. And studies have found that the vocabulary size of a child correlates with how often they're being read to in their home language. And so reading can help multilingual children maintain and strengthen the home language and build the foundation, the language foundation that they need in order to, first of all, to develop and maintain this foundation as well, but also to build further languages and learn different languages.
Yeah, I think about all the languages that I can read in. The ones that I can read in are the ones that I'm most fluent in. Yeah. Let's talk about a lot of people find struggles to find books in their home languages. Do you have a solution for them?
Of course, there are, especially us people with a little bit of lower status languages, where the supply of books is not big. Parents can use, for example, with younger children, wordless books are great because they're not really language dependent. And my favorite ones are search and find books. They're a big hit in our family. And it's the sort of Where's Waldo, but there are so many different ones. And we recently found one with penguins that go on a trip. And there is so much happening on every page because they go on many different trips. They go to the North Pole, they go to Egypt, they go to Paris, they go to London, but this is packed with so much action. And there is so much that you can do with those pictures. So many things you can talk about, so many stories, a wealth of vocabulary. And even if some of those books come with a little bit of text, they're fantastic to use as a reading resource. And it's great to practice, more flexible approaches too, like translanguaging. And of course, using a book in a certain language that you speak and translating as you go is also fantastic. But yeah, and I always find illustrations very, especially for visual learners like me, I find illustrations very powerful. And they say don't judge a book by the cover, but I sometimes do, I have to admit, because you feel very attracted to the illustrations, and there is a lot you can do. They're also great for building vocabulary, because reading is a receptive skill, but it can be extremely interactive, and it should be at home. When you talk about the story, and when you talk about the pictures and the characters, and even before you start reading, you can and should talk to your child and discuss what they expect to see in the book, what they expect to hear, what they think the story is about. And there's a lot of vocabulary that can be pulled out of this.
I like the idea of finding like search and find books, and you could use your home languages to talk about, let's find this and let's find that. Let's find the pumpkin in using Khmer. Let's find the house in Khmer. And so students are using that language that they hear connected into a wordless picture book. So wonderful.
Yes, and it helps them learn concepts, right? It's great for concept learning as well.
Right. That's where heritage home languages are so helpful, because they help kids understand a concept such as like friendship first, and then they're able to apply that to when they hear friendship in another language, like, oh, I already know what that is.
Yeah, so they basically just need to learn the new word in the new language for it, but they don't have to reacquaint themselves with the meaning of it.
Right. Can you elaborate on why reading out loud to children is so important?
Reading aloud is a very powerful tool. It can be very inspirational and motivational for children, to get them excited about different topics in different books. Above all else, it nurtures the love for reading. And as I mentioned before, it's really important for a child to learn to read for pleasure. It also, of course, supports the exposure to the home language. It allows for discussions and deliberations and vocabulary learning as well. Another great thing that we can do when we read aloud is we can expose our children to literature that they're not necessarily able to access on their own. If it's more difficult texts, we can read it to them and talk about it and explain it. Of course, it helps expand vocabulary. And last but not least, is great for comprehension and developing of listening skills.
So what role does child agency play in fostering a love of reading in multilingual children?
Okay, first, let me briefly mention what agency is. It's really simple. It's the active role that children can play in their own learning. And in our case, in their language learning, language development. So it's a huge motivating factor, allowing them to use their agency, because it happens very often that as children grow up, home languages get very neglected, especially if they're not a part of the school curriculum. They, children, they have a lot more interest, they have a lot more homework, so they don't really want to bother and build on their home language. But by allowing them to be a driving force in choosing what they read, choosing in their active learning, it can be very helpful and very motivating for them. It's something that I do with my son quite often when we go to the library. Is he has a clear idea of what he wants to find there, and I always let him explore, and we go through the different aisles and look at the different books, and I try to help him and encourage him to find different books. And we always have this rule that he takes a couple of books that he found, but we also take one or two books that I think might be interesting for him. And very often he finds them very interesting once he starts reading at home. Letting them choose and helping them in their choices and guiding them and showing them also what is possible and what else is out there.
You started talking about your experience with your son. Would you actually tell us more? As a parent who's raising bilingual children, can you share some tips that you would give to parents on what does that look like raising bilingual children to read? So what are the things that you do? Tell us more.
Having just talked about agency, I would definitely choose books that are interesting for them. And very often you can base your choices as a parent on their hobbies, their different interests, the things that they've mentioned. It's sometimes even, like they mention something along the way and then take a note and then offer a book to them on this topic. And also books that they have a favorite TV show. And of course, very often they would prefer to watch TV rather than sit and read a book or look at a book. So you can also find books that are based on the different characters of a TV show. Reading aloud, of course, is another thing. Focusing on the story is a very, very important thing to get them engaged, because if they look at a book, they might be like, oh, I don't leave me alone and don't bother me now with this. But when you talk about the story, when you try to, have a discussion with them, and especially with younger kids, this is really helpful when you try to act it out. Some parents feel like they're making fools of themselves. It's maybe it's not for everyone. Doing different voices and doing different characters. But very often I find my daughter, she's 4, and she loves that. So she takes a character and I take a character, or my husband, and we have our own little performance, but it's really helpful, because sometimes we even do this. We have a book and I speak Bulgarian, my husband speaks English, and then we kind of do our own little thing. And then she alternates depending on what she feels more comfortable with, in which context she uses either language. So it's really interesting to watch and experience and be a part of course.
That's really cute. So most of this podcast has been talking about families and their children. What strategies, what suggestions can you give to teachers in supporting parents as they help raise bilingual children to read in multiple languages?
First and foremost, parents need to know that they're not teachers. And learning to read at home and learning to read in school is completely different. And a lot of parents try to emulate the strategies that are used in school, and they don't have time, and they don't have the resources, and they don't have the knowledge and the experience to do that. And it just causes a lot of stress. And learning to read at home should be more relaxed, a little bit more casual. And parents need to know that anything can be reading at home. Shopping lists, postcards, everything is reading and writing. And I think parents and teachers should really build very strong partnerships in talk about the different literacy interests of the child at home. So parents shouldn't be worried that reading at home would somehow interfere with reading in school. And if they see different influence from one language or the other, they should know that that's quite normal. And I think exchanging information like this is very important. So teachers know that children are interested, that they're developing multiple literacies at the same time. And if they see that they're either lagging behind or they're writing, making spelling mistakes or mispronouncing things, that they know where that comes from.
That gives us a lot to think about. I think the next article you should be writing about is called Myths for Developing Multilingual Children, right?
Yes.
For parents, so you keep bursting myths.
Yes, I have one in my pipeline. Yes.
Oh, perfect.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's end the podcast this way. What do you ask teachers to stop doing, start doing, and continue doing? You can talk about parents or teachers in terms of raising bilingual children to read.
I think parents should be role models. I think this is a very big thing, a very big one, because children learn by example a lot more than from being told what to do. It's a lifelong process. It's not something that can be done. A lot of parents say, "Oh, I want my child to be fluent in 3 years." It doesn't happen like this. It's a gradual and it's a very modular experience. It has ebbs and flows, and depending on your context and depending on the purpose you're using your languages for, sometimes they get really good in a language and the other language sort of falls behind, and then depending on the circumstances, it's the other way around. So it's a process, it's not a product, and we're still developing our languages as we enter adulthood and later.
What about the other two? Stop doing and continue doing.
Flexible and adapting your family language policy on a regular basis, because every time your child has a new interest or something big happens in your life, you need to look at your strategy and adapt your strategy. So it's also an ongoing process. And what they should stop doing is they should stop doing that. Mixing language is confusing. This is one of the things that I hear on a regular basis, and a lot of parents are really very much fixated on one language, not mixing and not making mistakes and being perfect, and it just doesn't. This is not how language learning and acquisition works. So being more relaxed and enjoying the process.
Well, this has been an enjoyable process as well. Thank you for spending your time. Spasiba. It means thank you for sharing and writing.
Totally welcome. Do vijdane. That's in Bulgarian.
The vijdane. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria.
That's been lovely.